USS Frank Cable left Apra Harbor on a Tuesday morning in June 2026 and anchored 40 nautical miles off Puerto Princesa. No press release. No SOUTHCOM statement. Not a single line in the Pacific Fleet newsfeed. She stayed 22 days. The official description was a bilateral maintenance exercise with the Philippine Navy. That description is accurate. It is also not why the Navy sent her there. Frank Cable is a submarine tender. She does not fight. She does not chase. She does not patrol. She is, by design, the least glamorous hull in any fleet inventory. A floating machine shop, a weapons depot, a shore power barge, a parts warehouse, all welded into a single 11,000-ton hull. The Navy moves her only when it needs to service submarines, somewhere a base cannot reach, or somewhere a base should not exist. 40 miles off Palawan, 22 days. No base, no statement. That move does not add up on the surface. Why park a submarine tender at an unimproved anchorage in the West Philippine Sea, inside the range of planned shore-based missiles, during a bilateral maintenance window with the Philippine Navy? And more to the point, who is that anchorage actually for? The periscope view does not show a gap in coverage. It shows a submarine already on station, already watching, and the tender that made it possible sitting in frame beside it. Here is the short version. The Frank Cable deployment was not about maintenance. It was about geometry. Palawan sits at the northern edge of the West Philippine Sea, one Bashi Channel transit from the South China Sea's contested interior. Park a submarine tender there for 22 days and you have just created a forward operating point for Virginia-class attack submarines that Beijing cannot pre-target, cannot interdict through diplomatic channels, and cannot replicate with anything currently in its order of battle. It is not a base. It is something harder to counter than a base. To understand why, you need to understand what a submarine tender actually does, what the map looks like from Palawan, and what the Pacific Fleet has been assembling for the last 3 years. An Emery-S land-class tender like Frank Cable can service 2 nuclear attack submarines simultaneously at anchor. She carries the full suite of spare parts, lubricants, hydraulic fluids, and electronic components that an SSN consumes on a sustained forward deployment. She can replenish weapon shapes, Tomahawk cruise missiles and MiG-48 torpedoes, transferred alongside without the submarine returning to a fixed port. She can provide shore power, which lets a submarine shut down its reactor for maintenance cycles without losing hotel power. She carries a crew of over 1,400, including nuclear plant technicians, weapons handling teams, and electronics repair specialists that no submarine carries on its own. And she can do all of this at a simple anchorage. No pier, no fixed infrastructure, no status of forces agreement covering a permanent basing arrangement. The tender at anchor is the variable. The press release photographs but does not explain. On screen, it looks like a support ship. On the operational timeline, it is the reason the submarine does not have to turn back. Remove it from the frame, and the whole forward posture disappears with it. The U.S. military has been trying to expand its physical presence in the Philippines since 2014, when the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement opened Philippine bases to American forces on a rotational basis. The legal framework is there. The political will in Manila shifted significantly after 2022, when the Marcos administration pivoted toward Washington following years of Duterte-era equivocation. New EDCA sites were announced in 2023, including locations on Luzon's northern coast aimed directly at the Taiwan contingency. By July 2026, the United States had committed funding for Philippine Coast Guard base expansion along the western Palawan coast, giving Manila infrastructure while sidestepping the political complexity of an American military installation. But building a fixed American submarine base on Philippine soil is a different matter entirely. It requires sustained Philippine legislative support. It creates a permanent coordinate in the planned targeting database. It becomes a political liability every time a new administration takes office in Manila, and Philippine administrations have varied enormously in their posture toward U.S. basing since the Senate voted to close Subic Bay and Clark in 1991. Fixed bases can be counted, mapped, and held hostage to bilateral politics in ways that an anchored tender cannot be. The obstacle was not military capability. It was political architecture. The Pacific Fleet needed forward submarine support in the West Philippine Sea. It could not build the base. So it built something that is not a base and cannot easily be made to function as one for diplomatic purposes, even though it performs the same operational function. Here is what most coverage of this deployment missed. The debate inside Pacific Fleet over the last 3 years has not been whether to push submarines further west. The Virginia-class force already operates in the South China Sea regularly. The debate has been about how to sustain them once they are there. A Virginia-class SSN can transit from Guam to the South China Sea in roughly 4 to 5 days. She can operate on station for weeks without resupply. But maintenance cycles, weapon expenditure, and crew rest requirements eventually bring her back to a fixed port. If that port is Guam or Yokosuka, effective on-station time in the contested Western Pacific shrinks considerably because of transit overhead on both ends of every patrol cycle. The math does not favor sustained forward presence under that model. The public debate on submarine deployment strategy tends to focus on the boats, hull numbers, acoustic signature improvements, payload capacity of the Block V Virginia. But going through Pacific Fleet logistics, documents, and open-source analysis of tender movements back to 2019, one detail keeps surfacing. The bottleneck in forward submarine operations is not the submarine. It is the logistics chain behind it. Frank Cable sitting off Palawan is the answer to that bottleneck. The submarine is not the weapon system. The tender plus the submarine together is the weapon system. Now look at the map. A Virginia-class submarine running at sustained speed closes the distance westward from a holding position east of Palawan. On screen, the periscope view sweeps the horizon. Second Thomas Shoal within reach in under 14 hours, Scarborough Shoal in under 20. Then the submarine surfaces alongside a tender at anchor, and Frank Cable's technical crews move across the deck. Weapons transferred, systems serviced, the boat underway again before the next day's watch begins. That is not an exercise pattern. That is a combat logistics cycle. The anchorage does not look like a forward operating point because it has no buildings, no flag, no garrison. It functions as one regardless. The map also shows something that did not make the open-source reporting, how that geometry stacks against the plan's own submarine logistics picture in the South China Sea. We cut one specific range and cycle time comparison from this analysis for length. Comment MH if you want a follow-up that runs the full numbers comparing plan versus U.S. submarine forward logistics in the Western Pacific. Now consider the plan's position on that same map. The People's Liberation Army Navy has built an anti-access and area denial architecture across the South China Sea over the last 15 years at a cost defense economists estimate at $200 to $300 billion across the full program. The DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles provide theoretical strike capability against surface combatants at ranges beyond 1,000 nautical miles. HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries on the artificial islands of the Spratly Chain extend air defense coverage across the central South China Sea. J-16 and J-11B fighter bomber regiments based on Hainan can range the entirety of the contested sea lanes from their permanent airfields. Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels maintain persistent presence around the key reefs and shoals. On paper, the architecture controls the board. The problem, from Beijing's planning perspective, is that the entire system was designed against a surface threat, against carriers and their strike groups, against Arleigh Burke destroyers, against amphibious ready groups, against the large and acoustically loud surface combatants that defined American forward presence in the 1990s and early 2000s. The plan built a net to catch those ships. Submarines move under the net. And here is where the Frank Cable deployment shifts from a logistics story to a strategic one. The tender off Palawan is not just sustaining submarines. She is sustaining submarines already operating inside the A2/AD envelope. The missile batteries on Subi Reef and Mischief Reef are optimized for surface and air targeting. A Virginia-class SSN transiting at depth does not appear on their radar tracks. It does not enter their fire control solutions. The architecture that cost China $300 billion in 15 years to build has, at its operational core, a submarine-shaped hole in the coverage. The tender riding at anchor changes every number on that timeline. On screen, it is a gray hull and a working deck. In the operational picture, it is the reason a Virginia-class boat can hold station, reload, and hold station again. A submarine that can only remain on station for a limited period before returning to Guam is a signaling instrument. Temporary. It communicates capability but not commitment. A submarine with a mobile logistics node 40 miles off Palawan, cycling through maintenance and weapon replenishment on a 24-hour schedule, is a sustained presence. The difference between temporary and sustained is the difference between a signal and a fact on the ground. Pacific Fleet has been sending signals in the South China Sea for a decade. The Frank Cable deployment is the first visible step toward a sustained submarine presence architecture that does not require a permanent fixed base on Philippine soil and does not depend on the Philippine political cycle to maintain. That is the move. And the audience for that move is not in Manila. What strikes me about this deployment is how precisely it threads the gap between what the alliance requires and what Philippine domestic politics can sustain. Washington has understood since at least 2016 that fixed basing in the Philippines is structurally exposed to the electoral cycle and the personal dispositions of whoever holds the presidency in Manila. A floating logistics node changes that calculus. It is, in a real sense, alliance architecture that does not depend on the alliance holding perfectly in every election cycle. That design principle deserves significantly more attention in the public strategic debate than it has received. Now to what Beijing must do in response. When planned strategic planners assess the Frank Cable deployment, they face a specific and compounding problem. The tender establishes a proof of concept. If a 22-day station is operationally viable in June 2026, a 45-day rotation is viable in 2027. A permanent rotating tender presence, cycling between Subic Bay and Palawan anchorages, is viable by 2028 under current bilateral frameworks. Each increment is defensible under the legal language of EDCA. Each increment is framed as a bilateral exercise. Each increment extends the effective operating endurance of American submarine forces in the South China Sea without crossing any of the political or legal tripwires that a permanent fixed base would trigger. The plan's response options are constrained on multiple axes. Diplomatically, China has already protested every EDCA expansion, every RIMPAC participation by Philippine forces, every U.S. freedom of navigation operation near the Spratlys. The diplomatic protest mechanism is saturated. Militarily, striking a submarine tender at anchor in Philippine waters would require China to initiate hostilities against a treaty ally of the United States, potentially activating the Mutual Defense Treaty and drawing responses from Japan, Australia, and other Indo-Pacific partners simultaneously. The cost of direct interdiction is asymmetric in a direction that does not favor Beijing's current risk calculus. The deployment was not without friction. Open-source tracking of Frank Cable's movements in late May 2026 showed a 24-hour delay in her departure from Apra Harbor, consistent with either a last-minute weather assessment for the transit south or a logistics coordination issue with Philippine naval counterparts at Puerto Princesa. The anchorage position she eventually established was shifted approximately 6 nautical miles north of the initially reported coordinate, suggesting either deliberate operational security adjustments or a seabed assessment issue at the original location. Whatever the specific cause, the schedule held. She was on station within the planned operational window and maintained the anchorage for the full 22 days without reported incident. That operational flexibility is itself part of the strategic message. A tender that can adjust anchorage coordinates, reschedule around weather, and coordinate quietly with Philippine counterparts without generating a diplomatic incident is a more durable instrument than a fixed installation with a permanent footprint and an American flag flying over the main gate. Here is a take that will probably draw some disagreement. The Frank Cable deployment off Palawan is a more significant strategic development than the USS Emery-S. Land rotation through Subic Bay earlier in 2026, and it received a fraction of the coverage. Subic Bay is a name that carries historical weight. Puerto Princesa does not. But the Palawan anchorage is geometrically superior to Subic Bay for forward submarine operations against the Spratly Chain, Second Thomas Shoal, and Scarborough Shoal. The logistics node that matters strategically is the one the cameras did not follow. The story that will define this theater in 10 years is not the story that ran on the wire services. Now place this deployment inside the architecture Pacific Fleet has been assembling since 2023. The AUKUS agreement committed the United States to stationing Virginia-class submarines at HMAS Sterling near Perth, Australia, with rotational visits escalating toward a permanent presence. The logic is to extend American and eventually Australian SSN reach into the eastern Indian Ocean and the southern approaches to the South China Sea. Guam continues to receive investment in submarine berths, dry dock expansion, weapons storage, and Aegis ashore integration. The Yokosuka homeport sustains carrier and surface combatant presence in the north, complemented by the USS Ronald Reagan's Air Wing and the surface combatant screen of Destroyer Squadron 15. What had been absent from that architecture was a forward logistics node on the Western Arc, something capable of sustaining submarines in the South China Sea's contested interior without the transit cost of returning to Guam or the political cost of a fixed Philippine base. On paper, the Palawan anchorage should not work effectively as a forward logistics node. It sits exposed to South China Sea weather during typhoon season. It is within the theoretical strike envelope of plan assets on Hainan and the Spratly Chain. It requires Philippine cooperation subject to political contingency. But none of those constraints carry the weight that the geometry carries. 40 miles off Puerto Princesa is the single most valuable logistics coordinate in the Western Pacific for sustaining a submarine presence against the contested shoals. The constraints are real but manageable. The geometry is decisive. The Frank Cable deployment proved that the coordinate is operationally viable. That validation matters more than the 22 days themselves. The deeper question this deployment raises is one that Pacific strategy analysts are genuinely divided on. At what point does a rotational tender presence become functionally equivalent to a permanent base in terms of what it commits the United States to defending? If Frank Cable returns to that anchorage in 2027, and again in 2028, and again in 2029, has the U.S. effectively established a forward-basing presence in the West Philippine Sea, regardless of the legal framework governing each individual deployment? What do you think? Does the distinction between a tender at anchor and a fixed installation matter strategically over time, or is it a technicality that dissolves as the pattern becomes established? Here is where the board stands today. The United States has a demonstrated and tested logistics architecture for sustaining nuclear attack submarines in the West Philippine Sea without a permanent fixed base. The plan's anti-access system was designed against surface ships and has a structural gap at the subsurface level. The Philippine alliance is deepening along the western coast of Palawan, with U.S.-funded Coast Guard infrastructure under construction, the USS Emery-S. Land rotation through Subic, the Frank Cable deployment to Palawan, and the AUKUS submarine station at HMAS Sterling describe 3 points of a triangle that did not exist 4 years ago. What remains unresolved is the variable no single deployment answers. China is expanding its submarine fleet at a pace that will approach American numbers in the Western Pacific by the end of this decade. The Virginia-class production line is under industrial strain. Philippine political commitment to EDCA, however robust under the current administration, has reversed before and could reverse again. The tender can weigh anchor in 8 hours and leave no fixed target behind. The geometry that makes Palawan irreplaceable does not leave with her. One detail that stayed with me in reviewing the open-source coverage: not a single major English-language defense outlet ran a substantive analysis on the Frank Cable anchorage during its first 2 weeks on station. The Philippine Defense Press noted the visit. Chinese state media mentioned it once, briefly, without strategic analysis. The signal Pacific Fleet transmitted in June 2026 was received clearly in the 2 capitals that mattered. Everywhere else, it was background noise in a busy news cycle. That is typically how the most significant deployments work. The F-35B lifts vertically off the carrier deck while the submarine slips below the surface in the same operational picture. 2 platforms, 2 axes of approach, 1 channel connecting them. The Bashi channel running north of Luzon sits at the edge of that frame, and the current force posture visible on screen does not yet show what is already transiting it. The board favors the United States today in the Western Pacific submarine geometry. Boards change. This one is changing slower than the plan can develop a credible answer for the coordinate 40 miles off Puerto Princesa. The tender sailed. The anchorage remained.